Well, ladies and gentlemen, I am as happy to see all of you as I take it some of you are to see me. And I do have to say that as grateful as I am for Todd's incredibly generous introduction, I fear that the bar has been raised to heights that I cannot possibly clear. So that's always the risk when people like you. And goodness gracious, Todd was reading through the introduction. He got about halfway, and I was like, I don't even remember about a third of those things, I think. And so, I hope folks don't feel too inundated right off the bat. But I do have to say that I'm deeply warmed by the invitation and the spirit of hospitality that I've been presented with here. And so thank you very kindly for that. And that may be an appropriate place to make an observation. We live in a moment in American society of intense and fiery passions, conviction applied to social and political causes to rescue America from the demons that are our partisan enemies, tends to be the theme and spirit with which we approach the politics of the moment in a democracy that really functions best when it's grounded upon a culture of understanding, patience, and a willingness to reason together across our divides. But in a climate of hostility such as we experience today, it is easy for Americans of all colors and all stripes politically to feel themselves disenchanted, isolated, alienated, not just from the people who they may always have disagreed with or been removed from culturally, but even from people who they had felt closeness and familiarity with, philosophical compatriots, family and friends. Because we have entered an era of American life where somehow or other differences in a democracy add up to zero-sum conflicts between our very identities and maybe even our very existence. And this is a posture that cannot be sustained in a constitutional republic that may yet have a chance of withstanding the test of time. And so, as I was talking with one of you about before I came up here, I look at the work of Braver Angels, the work of many organizations dedicated to reviving trust in our social fabric, and indeed, this noble enterprise, the North American Unitarian Association, as being dedicated to the cause of reviving our memory and our commitment to the fundamentals of democracy, the fundamentals of civic society, and maybe even within that, the fundamentals of human relationships. How it is we must be inclined to treat each other and look at one another and feel towards one another in order to create the space for us to reasonably and charitably confront the most difficult problems that face us while still maintaining the relationships that undergird the stability of society and the potential for human progress. So I'm very pleased, of course, that within this group, we have some of my spiritual kinfolk at Braver Angels, so to speak, civic spiritual kinfolk at Braver Angels here in the crowd. I saw a couple of y'all here. I think my friend in the hat here, and I saw somebody else over in the corner. Hi there. One of the reasons I was eager to accept this invitation is because Unitarians have been a tremendous part of Braver Angels community since the very beginning. And yet, I think this is my first time ever speaking to an organized body of Unitarians, and I hope that it's not the last, whether it is this particular body or others, whatever differences may currently exist within members of this larger church. But it does make it appropriate for me, I think, to say a little bit more about Braver Angels, about what Braver Angels is and our mission and approach to divisions in society. So I'll take just a brief moment to do that here. Braver Angels, for which I'm National Ambassador, is America's largest grassroots bipartisan organization, as Todd mentioned, committed to bridging the partisan divide, depolarizing our politics. But I really like to deepen that by saying that what we're really about is reviving the communal fabric of American democracy. We started in the aftermath of the 2016 election with a single workshop that we would use to bring together small folks from the right and from the left, reds and blues, as we say in-house, not to argue or debate politics, principally speaking, at least not at first, but to speak from the vantage point of their own personal experience in terms of why they see politics the way that they do. Basically, it was marriage counseling for the relationship between Republicans and Democrats, which, probably feels appropriate. And from that humble starting point, we have become an organization with about going on 14,000 members across the country, evenly bipartisan in our leadership and our sources of philanthropic support with programs in Congress, state and local government, college campuses across America, even some high schools, digital media content, podcasts and articles and videos, an arts community that includes singers and songwriters and performers that use their craft as a means of more deeply creating cultural connection across the divide. But again, fundamentally, we are grassroots at Braver Angels with about upwards of 100 or so local bipartisan alliances, local chapters, but we call them alliances, polka dotted across America, including one in Seattle, and there may be others in the state of Washington as well. And I encourage folks to look into both Braver Angels locally and in the state and nationally for anybody who is inclined to join us in our efforts and to deepen what has been from the very start an inspired relationship that exists between the Unitarian community at large and the civic community of Braver Angels. But having said that, and having framed some of the strange of the moment in the context of the alienation that has become pervasive within the American family, and as we sadly note within the Unitarian family, I do want to say a little bit to frame my own sort of personal entryway into this larger cause. Todd had mentioned a little bit about my political background. It's true that I was a Republican nominee for Congress way back, it was 2014 or so, 10 years ago. I also grew up a liberal activist opposing the Iraq War. I was somebody who felt jaded after George W. Bush won re-election, worked very hard to elect Barack Obama in 2008, wound up studying conservatism in an effort to bring Republicans and conservatives into the Obama movement, discovered that from a policy vantage point in a number of cultural ways, I was in fact sort of a moderate conservative myself, but I still believed in what I felt to be the anti-tribal spirit of hope and change. That 2008 campaign and that 2004 keynote address that Barack Obama delivered at the Democratic National Convention, in which he said that we are not red states or blue states, but the United States of America, that we are not a black, white, or Latino America, but the United States of America. To me, that was the real cause of the Obama campaign. And so I actually ran as a Republican, as a hope and change Republican in South Los Angeles, and did so very, very earnestly and sincerely. But I was young, and so when people would ask me, what at the age of 26, and I should say that the district, the California 43rd, Maxine Waters district, it just so happened to be, predominantly Democrat, predominantly black and brown, but with strong pockets of conservatives in South Bay, in the parts of South Bay, LA County that were represented in the district. And so whether I was speaking to a black Democratic-leaning church in South Central Los Angeles or to a white Tea Party club in South Bay, LA County, people would ask me, well, what at your age makes you qualified to represent a district as diverse and complicated as the California 43rd. And I'd say, well, I come from an interesting family background. My mother is a liberal black Democrat from inner city Los Angeles. My father's a conservative white Republican from Tennessee. I grew up explaining my father to my mother to my father, and that's why I can represent all of you. Right. And it tended to be good for a laugh, and sort of summed up where I was coming from. Because in an era of American politics in which we have come to view Democrats and Republicans as the enemy, for me, fundamentally, Democrats and Republicans are simply mom and dad. And so, I have lived a life at the middle of various intersections that has made it incumbent upon me to try and see the humanity in very different groups of people, if only to be able to see the humanity in myself. And so that is a little bit of my story. Now, to try and bring it bring it down to this place a little bit, there is a fascinating history to the Unitarian Church that I am just starting to become mindful of. And I was reading a little bit of Todd's work that I guess got him into trouble in the first place. And it's remarkable to read the story of a church that has traveled the ages in a spirit of commitment to a humanism rooted in an appreciation of, in the very origins of the Christian tradition, a rootedness in an appreciation of the humanity of Christ that sets a full-bodied example for the way in which reason must spring from a place of understanding and compassion in the way we actually pursue the art of discussion in a modern and contemporary society. That's a fascinating way of engaging the world, because there's a way in which the values of our society have evolved in certain quarters so as to value intelligence of intellect without a corresponding commitment to the realizing of human dignity and the emotional connections we share with one another. Martin Luther King Jr., who I want to speak about at some length today, said that we are all heirs to a legacy of human dignity. And indeed, the foundation of Dr. King's philosophy of nonviolence rested upon the principle of agape love, this idea that love is a spiritual force that can affect social transformation, and that agape love, not a sentimental or affectionate love necessarily, but an overarching goodwill for your opponent, carries with it a power to speak to the conscience of our opposition, to the conscience of those who disagree with us, such that we may be able to signal to them that disagreements and even moral opposition in the context of a particular issue does not make us enemies. That we do not seek the truth, we do not seek to defeat our opponents politically because we seek to defeat them indeed, but rather we seek to win a society that is allied to truth and love for the sake of our enemies as well as ourselves, as well as our friends. And so Dr. King said that we do not seek to defeat or humiliate the opponent, we do not seek to defeat or humiliate the white man, but to win his friendship and his trust so that we may be reconciled to one another in the beloved community. I see the fundamental disposition of the Unitarian tradition as striving towards the beloved community. But we cannot strive towards the beloved community unless we are able to travel the length of the tensions of our disagreements in a spirit of love and understanding. And I note that in Todd's book, in his essay on race, and Todd, I'm not going to get the quotation exactly right, but you make reference to reason and thought as a type of productive love. Why? Because reason is not something that we actually properly do just within ourselves alone in a solitary capacity. Reason is something that we engage in communally, in conversation with one another. But in order to reason, we have to be willing to do more than talk. We have to be willing to listen. And you cannot listen effectively to people unless you are willing to genuinely hear them in a spirit of understanding, in a spirit that says that even though they might be wrong, I myself as an individual am almost certainly wrong in any number of things, and that therefore is humility that recognizes the fallibility of humanity, but our collective capacity to aspire towards truth and a more perfect way of being in the world requires me to acknowledge your dignity by hearing what you have to say. Not because we are... Not because you or I are perfect, but precisely because you and I am not perfect. But together we can be more perfect if we listen to each other. Now, these are, I think, principles and pieces of wisdom that are inherent in the Unitarian tradition that I see as echoing in the work of braver angels and indeed in the substance of the nonviolent philosophy of Martin Luther King Jr. But of course, the challenge that faces all principles in general is that they do have to make contact with the substance of social and political and human problems in their particulars. And race is an area of American life and American history that we know is broadly tragic in so many respects and has many particular realities that have to be wrestled with. We don't have time here for a comprehensive disquisition on the subject, but I do want to talk a little bit about what I know about African American history and the African American experience in this country as a way of offering some perspective as to how collectively we might all engage in discourse on matters of race, with not just a little more context, but a good deal more commitment to empathy on all sides. And this is my message to the United States of America, and certainly to my friends in the Unitarian Church and all sides of the current controversies, recognizing the fact that I am a newcomer to this space. And so I offer a little bit of my overall perspective in the hopes that it may be helpful. The Black American experience is not one that is well understood in its broader dimensions if you're only taking a left or right narrative kind of look at it. We've seen the 1619 Project versus 1776 narrative play out where the fundamental questions are, well, is America a white supremacist nation that is systemically racist, or is it a country in which you, by virtue of your merit and your dedication, can achieve the American dream no matter the color of your skin? And like with most complicated things, the truth is yes, no, neither, and both. But I tell the story in this way, to start in broad historical terms, of course. I mean, we, of course, know that, slavery arrived on American shores in the context of what used to be called Negro slavery in 1619, and hence the 1619 Project, when a small group of slaves were brought into the very beginnings of colonial America. And we know that that story progresses into the founding of the United States of America, in which slavery remains, the Civil War, in which the Emancipation Proclamation was declared, slavery eventually abolished, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments passed and affirmed, and yet freed African Americans were generally released into a period of not just poverty, not just lack of education, but actual terrorism from members of the Ku Klux Klan and defeated and demoralized and outraged and deeply traumatized people in the postbellum South. This history continues into the 20th century, where things like redlining and segregation in the labor force constricts the opportunities of African Americans, and yet thriving African American communities and families do emerge across different parts of the United States. A black intelligentsia sort of rises and forms and begins to culminate in its effort in the mid-20th century civil rights movement, or the inspired leadership of certainly Martin Luther King Jr., but many others. A number of organizations, not just the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but the NAACP, the Urban League, and others, rallied together, but as led by Martin Luther King Jr., in an effort not just to seek legal reform in American society, but to advance a vision of what it means to live up to the words of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, to realize the true values and teachings of the American founding, to honor the genuine legacy of Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, I would argue, and certainly Abraham Lincoln, generation or so afterwards. And so you had the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, eventually the Fair Housing Act after that. And even with the death of Martin Luther King Jr., and maybe in a way charged by it, you had a larger cultural commitment in American mainstream society towards recognizing and celebrating the dignity and worth of African Americans. You had an expanded black middle class that suddenly found a place of influence in American universities and in the political parties, in American corporations, and certainly athletics and entertainment. And that black middle class grew over the 70s and the 80s and the 90s in a way to where it flourishes in many respects, even while income inequality and all manner of statistical differences between the black middle class and the white middle class still persist. But in comparison to the history that we are trailing behind us, progress has been undeniable for this black middle class. What gets lost in that story oftentimes, though, is that for the remaining, and how you quantify this is a matter of some discussion. But let's say for a remaining 20 or 30% of the African American community, in an era where the gains of the civil rights movement that predominantly accrued to the rural South were already taking place in a moment of time where the bulk of African Americans had already moved out of the South and into major urban centers, the pre-existing conditions of poverty were not ameliorated by having won the right to vote all over again in the rural South, or by having desegregated lunch counters or even schools. But that pre-existing condition of poverty, demoralized even further by the death of prominent African American leaders, found itself more impacted by the advent of crack cocaine and heroin into American inner cities, by the departure of manufacturing jobs overseas, and the economic dislocation of African Americans in the agricultural and the service sectors having to do with changes in immigration policy and demographic shifts that took place in historically black communities. The advent of the drug economy fueling the growth of gang activity in African American communities, but that precipitating an often corrupt and deeply militaristic response from law enforcement, supported in a bipartisan way by the politicians of the era, that resulted in the mass incarceration phenomenon that has carried over from the 70s to accelerating the 80s, reaching a pinnacle in the mid-1990s, but even into the 2000s, resulting in a status quo in which at the same time you have an expanding black middle class in America, you have a black underclass and an imprisoned class that has also grown. And for those African Americans whose African American lineage, therefore, travels from slavery to white terrorism in the South, to redlining and discrimination in the labor unions, to a civil rights movement whose gains did not altogether accrue to them, to the mass incarceration phenomenon and dislocation, all the way up to the present day, for many of these African Americans, it is hard to find a point on that timeline where the American dream genuinely shows up. And so this is a larger sense of the arc to that story, which explains a little bit about where people, in their emotional commitment to social justice, are oftentimes, if we're being charitable in our interpretation of that passion, it gives a sense of what people are feeling, even if they don't know all the details of that history. When they feel like they need to throw caution to the wind and burn bridges and relationships with the people who used to matter most to them in order to advocate for what they feel to be a historic cause of justice. We have to understand that because it is rooted in something. Now, I tell that story in a different way and in a much shorter way. Also, I'm an African American, half African American, but I'm a black man. I grew up in Culver City, California, very liberal, progressive, multicultural communities. Matter of fact, the school district I went to was ranked the 4th most diverse school district in America. I live where the motion picture studios are generally concentrated. Most of them are not actually in Hollywood, they're in Culver City, California. And I tell people, I grew up in King's promised land in a very real way. I grew up, again, in a biracial, multicultural family and community. It's not just black, white. I've got cousins who are Brazilian, Belizean, and Mexican, et cetera. And if anything, I felt like I was sort of celebrated for the color of my skin. It seemed to symbolize something to people about sort of where America had come to. But I tell people about my memory of the riots in 1992, in the aftermath of the Rodney King beatings, the Los Angeles riots, which set so much of Los Angeles, and particularly Black Los Angeles, ablaze in the aftermath of that tragic incident. And I tell people that, for me, that is a vague memory of the shadow of tension in my mind. I can remember my father pacing about, being worried. I can remember seeing disturbing things on the news. I remember my mother drove to work one day, and she came back, and my father seemed afraid, and I didn't altogether understand why. And he told me years later, he said, where she worked was near enough to the violence to where I was afraid that I might never see her again. And I said to myself, damn it, why did I let her go? But she came back just like she always did, and everything was fine. 15 minutes and 15 miles away, however, in the Jordan Downs project in Watts, the woman who would eventually become my wife was living in an American war zone, having to lie on the floor in case bullets should pass through the window, smelling the smoke from fires burning, hearing the howling screams of sirens passing back and forth, people shouting and screaming outside for 3 days. And in a life growing up in that neighborhood, what for a long time was the most violent neighborhood in the state of California. My wife, over the course of her years growing up, saw more violence and perhaps more death that some people see serving in Iraq and Afghanistan. Her American story and her memory of it began in an American war zone, in the most prosperous city, in the most prosperous state, in the most prosperous country in the world. We are both black people, but products of different streams of the black lineage, of this black history that I've laid out. And so the complexity of the black experience in America has to be seen in that way, as well as the complexity and sometimes sort of partial understanding reflected in the way many white people respond to that history. Because there are pieces of it which most black people don't know and most white people don't know, because we don't have a culture that allows us to talk about these things reasonably and comprehensively, because we must partition parts of the truth so that they may be the property of polarizing political narratives. And that's what we have to get beyond. So I understand when people are of a mind to say that we can't waste time on reasoned discussion when the priority of representation is something, inequity, are things that we must stand behind in order to break the hold of white supremacy on society. But it is still a reductive narrative, which would be okay if we had a culture in which we were willing to listen to different points of view. The need to be able to run institutions and organizations in a way that allows people to prioritize the standards and the principles and the virtues that go in to animating, whether it is a ministry, whether it is a corporation, whether it is an organ of government, that prioritizes people's values and their ability to serve in a given position, irrespective of the color of their skin, is a liberal value worth defending. But it should come with a concomitant societal dedication to making sure that the most disadvantaged among us have access to the resources, to the education, to the community institutions, to the social networks that allow them to develop within themselves the capacities to do what we all know that all Americans of all colors are capable of doing, which is to live up to their God-given potential to succeed in their own merits and in their own rights. This doesn't mean that diversity cannot be a meaningful consideration in matters of hiring and creating cultures of education in college and university campuses. But if we believe that, let's make the proactive argument for that. Rather than saying that somebody who has a different point of view on the relative importance of diversity for diversity's sake and the qualifications and criteria by which we base our hiring decisions or our recruiting decisions in any particular American institution does not have legitimate concerns about the way in which we honor the role and obligation of our institution in society, but rather is just reflecting an unconscious white racism. That is not likely to be true. And I don't think it's true for the North American Unitarian Association. I think that you, like all of us, are wrestling with deeply complicated sociological realities set against the backdrop of a deeply fraught and challenging American history in an age where our leading political interests are robbing us of the ability to wrestle with complexity in good faith across the divide. And many of you feel like you've been alienated and ostracized because you are trying to stay loyal to your principles while still recognizing the humanity of others in that context. And I want to tell you, your moral courage and strength is not in vain, because there are people across America, left and right, black and white, who feel exactly the way you do, even if they don't necessarily share all of your religious beliefs and all of your politics. Together, we can make the space for a consciousness to emerge in this society that allows us to wrestle with complexity together, that allows us to reason together as iron sharpens iron, and that allows us to strive towards the beloved community and the promised land that Dr. King foresaw in a spirit of goodwill and agape love. And with that, I thank you all for bringing me here today, and I'm happy to take a question or two. Thank you very much.